Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being with us for this dialogue. Actually, we are with Professor Kerry Brown from King's College London, presented with Center for China and Globalization. We're live in Beijing and at the CCG New Multimedia Center. Actually, the topic of our dialogue today is moving forward to a new future, China and the world in the upcoming post-pandemic world, and with also the upcoming two sections, and also we're going to discuss many issues. So very glad to welcome Professor Kerry Brown. Perhaps Kerry Brown, you want to say hi to our audience, which is live online?
Yeah, I'm very grateful to be here today. I'm in the UK at the moment. It's great to be able to work with CCG and with my good friend Henry Wang, and I'm really glad to be able to talk to people and understand your perspectives too. Good morning, good afternoon.
Great, good afternoon also for our audience in the world and also in UK as well. So this dialogue series is part of CCG China and World webinar series that we launched in March 2020 in an effort to engage eminent scholars, think tankers, and also government advisors, advocates, stakeholders, business folks in China and from around the world, basically to continue the exchange virtually while the travel across the boundaries are not possible, disrupted by the COVID-19. And so far, actually, CCG has conducted over 60 episodes of webinars and conference talks with topics on China-US relations with Europe, global pandemic fighting, cooperation, multilateral trade, technology innovation, and China domestic and economic reform, and of course, 14th Five-Year Plan, with millions of viewers in China and in the world as well. So today we are very pleased to have Professor Kerry Brown with us. Professor Kerry Brown actually is a professor of Chinese Studies and the director of Lau Institute at King's College London. He's very well known from 2012 to 2015. He was a professor at the university, professor of the Chinese politics and the director of China Study Centers at the University of Sydney, Australia. Prior to this, he worked at the Chatham House for over 6 years, actually, as a senior fellow and also the head of Asian program. Meanwhile, from 2011 to 2014, he directed the Europe-China Research and Advice Network, giving policy advice and to the European External Action Service. So he's quite knowledgeable on China and on the China international relations and also in the world at large. As a matter of fact, also Kerry is very versed in both Chinese and English. He has an MA from Cambridge University and a postgraduate diploma in Mandarin in Chinese from Thames Valley University, London, and also a PhD in Chinese politics and language from Leeds University. I know, Kerry, you are also the author of 10 books on modern Chinese politics and history and language, including What's Wrong with Diplomacy, the Case of UK and China, also a Berkshire Dictionary on China biography, and also China CEO Xi Jinping, and China's World, What Does China Want, just to name a few. So Kerry, I came to know you, of course. I remember a number of years ago, we were at a conference at Zurich in Switzerland. I mean, that was really, I heard you first time. We were very impressive. But also, we were happy that in 2018, we actually invited you to come to CCG, have a roundtable with the Chatham House delegation. Also, we had meetings at the Schwarzman College. So you are very well, actually, you are not strangers to CCG. And I'm very also impressed with the webinar you organized just some time ago on dialogues on dialogue. and which I think is really a very fascinating and deep thinking process that you have actually initiated. So the question we want to cover today is that we are at actually a very turning point or crossroad, you may say so, that, for example, China, in the last 10 days, we had President Xi has announced that China has actually reached the target of elevating extreme poverty, which basically lifted almost 800 million people out of poverty. And also China going to have a two section, which is a National People's Congress and also CCPCC, which is also Chinese Political Consultative Conference, going to be held, two sections going to be held in the next 2 days, and which China going to launch its 14th five-year plan. But of course, internationally, we see a lot of changes as well. We have a new President Biden that comes up, pursue a somewhat or quite different policy than President Trump. For example, on the multilateralism, that President Biden is very positive on the climate change and also on the other issues, pandemic fighting, for example, WHO support and things like that. But of course, we see him spoke at a Munich Security Conference just a week or 10 days ago that he actually talked about also, of course, China is a competitor, but also there are areas that can be collaborated with China as well. So we're at this actually jump point where we're starting a new Chinese year. So we would like to really, ask you and discuss with you on some of the new thought and some of the new thinking that you've been really contemplating for a number of years. I'm quite impressed with your dialogue on dialogue, for example, that really hit a lot of hot issues. For example, China is really a hybrid. From what I can know, China economy is really doing well. We had an event with World Bank just about a month or two ago that on the World Bank, the global economic outlook, where World Bank Vice President told me that China was the only major economy managed to have over 2% growth last year, and it's all, so we can see that internationally, everybody is talking about China, but China's image and of course China's what China has done has not been probably well understood outside China, or there's even some misunderstanding about China. So you're actually a very deep thinker and scholar that you have published almost 10, 20 books on Chinese modern history, politics, and Chinese world views. I know that your more recent book seems to switch the lens now from by looking at the world's view on China and concentrating on understandings between the West and China. But your forthcoming book is about how Europeans perceived China in the past 800 years. So probably you can tell us about your new book that is coming up.
Great, thank you very much. Well, look, thank you very much, Henry. And I mean, it's an interesting time because normally any year I would go to China several times. Like you said, in 2019, I was at the Schwarzman College in October and November, and then came to see you and saw other partners, and I'd go to Shanghai and other places. And so for the last year, there's been none of that kind of physical kind of traveling to and from China. So it means that we have to make an extra effort to maintain dialogue, particularly because politics never stops changing. Politics doesn't have to get on a plane and fly anywhere. Politics just happens wherever people are. And of course, the political context between China and the world has become much more complicated. And so because of that, I started to think about, was this always the case? Has it always been that Europe and China have, kind of had sort of a very, I wouldn't say an unbalanced relationship, but a difficult one. And so I went back further. I kept on seeing quotes to works by great European thinkers like Leibniz, like Montesquieu, like Voltaire, of course, Marx, Hegel, Max Weber in this century, Bertrand Russell, who actually went to China, I think, and was lecturing at Peking University in the early 1920s, and even further back to the time of the Jesuits, Matteo Ricci and people like this. And I kind of wondered whether there was this similar kind of, sort of almost like a kind of a dual view of China. Sometimes really admiring China, sometimes really criticizing China, and kind of how did Europeans figure it? That's really the foundation of this book. So I pulled together the main works referring to China by the figures I just mentioned. And I suppose what I was struck by is during the Enlightenment in the 18th, 19th centuries, particularly the 18th century, these great figures, Leibniz, who of course is one of the most important philosophers Europe produced, a real polyglot, a man of incredible abilities across a whole range of disciplines. Montesquieu, whose work, The Spirit of the Laws, was so influential in the foundation of American democracy and the American Constitution. And Voltaire, who, of course, is the, kind of ultimate skeptical liberal thinker who still is quoted today and read today. These figures did write about China, and they wrote about China in some detail. And although they hadn't been to China, of course, it wouldn't have been possible then to get to China very easily. They did have a very distinctive view. Voltaire was very admiring and really compared the, I suppose it would be the Qing court then, the Qing emperor, to, the kind of systems that existed in Europe, and felt that the secular kind of world of China without a state religion was preferable. Leibniz was very much led by looking at the evidence that came from the world of China via the Jesuits. He was very close to many of the Jesuit scholars and read their works a lot. And so he was really interested in what he called the sort of Confucian system of governance. And so really tried to look at what China presented to him. He wrote a line about how his position wasn't to make some value judgments, but just to try and understand and put that first of all. And then Montesquieu, who really regarded China as a sort of despotic, autocratic, kind of highly imperial system that was not at all attractive. So you've got, in a sense, the three positions, I suppose, that we still see today. I mean, it's extraordinary. We've come on 350 years, but these very entrenched positions are still there. The position of the admirer, the empiricist, I suppose, Leibniz, and then the, I wouldn't call it skeptical, but the dissenter. And I think European debate today, not talking about American debate, so we can refer to that, but European debate is divided between those, I think, who have a very critical view of China and regard China as a threat, those who are very admiring of China and of what it's done with its economy and its political system, and are, kind of not really that critical. And then the ones in the middle, and that middle space is declining, it's shrinking, who feel that we have to understand before we really make some big judgments, and that we have a lot to understand before we can get there. And I suppose that's really what universities are trying to do, though the politicization of universities has certainly increased and made it more difficult. I mean, I guess finally I would say today, and that's the reason why I did this book, because I wanted to know the historic roots of this. But today, I think it's more difficult than ever to have a reasoned debate about China or with Chinese colleagues that is not misinterpreted, that is not kind of framed as something that has some big political meaning, either pro or anti-China. I mean, if I study science, I mean, does it make any sense to say that I'm pro or anti-science? I mean, I'm studying science, right? I mean, my job as a sinologist, I guess, is to study China. There's many aspects of China, its culture, its history, its politics, its geography. I don't know what it means to say that I'm pro or anti-China. I'm just interested in the facts that I see about China. And I think that that spirit is something we have to get back.
Yeah, thank you, Kerry. Actually, a fascinating book. I see that you're writing and compiling actually all those historical figures, their interpretation of China, and but also there, as you said, there's probably different views. But it's good to go back to those historical views on China, and we can see how far that has been evolved and changed. And this is really going to be very stimulating and very forthcoming for both people in China, I think, around the world, to look at China on some historical perspective, but also realistically on modern China. As we all know, that China, as you said, it's a hybrid. I totally agree with that, because, for example, in the Chinese economy, which is doing extremely well, is that largely they practice the private sector as about 60-70% of that private sector, and then they have SOE, about another 10-15-20%, and another 10-20% of multinational foreign investment in China. So that actually seems to work well in China. As I read your paper, you also said that, of course, China has quite a lot of element. They have a Marx, they have a capitalist, a socialist, and Confucius. It's a hybrid, and so. But also, China doesn't have a strong religion in the past. So you can see that China always have a centralized, historically, due to the big floods and irrigation of vast territory or invaders from north. Now they have to be really very centralized to combat all the challenges, which is a culture and history over 5,000 years uninterrupted, and still maintain the genes of China. So I think that it's really fascinating that you are actually going to dip on that and look at how that's going to change, how we can really make more studies. I mean, let's not take a stand, but let's maybe more take a study on that. So what I would like to pursue on that is that you see China's, there's a gap on the world view between world and also China, even between different countries. So what do you think has contributed to this cognitive gap? Maybe how that view differently. What has been what can be improved or what can be done? I mean, both internally and externally for China and other countries, based on your observation. Maybe this is a question that I come to mind.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the three big things that are difficult for those outside of China, particularly if we talk about Europe and America, still as the most significant economic blocks in the world next to China. So Europe, America, and China constitute over half of global GDP. So if you put those three together, you can understand that for Europeans and Americans, I think that there are three things that are kind of very new and very difficult to really kind of understand. The first is, in modern history, I don't think there's ever been an appreciation of China as a sort of strong and powerful country. I mean, historically, since the 19th century and the era of colonization and, the beginning of the century of humiliation for China, the kind of way in which I think Western mindsets have looked towards China is a place which is marginal. As the work of Rana Mitter has shown, China's alliance in the Second World War was never really appreciated. It was really just a sort of side attendee at the important conferences after the war, even though it had been one of the main battlefronts for the American and British, kind of alliance against fascism. And so, this kind of marginality, I think, is in European and Americans' mindsets. And of course, now they're looking at a China which is economically and militarily and politically much, much stronger. It's not marginal at all. And it's being restored to a place of historic importance. And I think that this is proving very difficult. I think the attitude towards China that has been dominant for most of the post-war period is a place which is separate and not really part of the developed world. And now, of course, China is entering that world with a fifth of global GDP and a significant middle class. So this is a big, big change. And I think people's mindsets are really not used to sort of thinking of China as a major equal power. So that's the first problem for them. I think the second is that we've never really thought of China as a kind of global power. We thought of it as maybe a land power, and historically understood that the consolidation of China's land borders historically and after the People's Republic of China was established in 1949. This meant that China could be described as a land power. We've never thought of China as a naval power. And now, of course, we see that China has naval assets. I think it's got more vessels than the United States, though technologically, of course, there are big differences. So China as a power that actually gets way beyond its borders and has a naval capacity and also a cyber capacity, this is something new too. I don't think really we have got used to this idea. And it's really only since 1980s. I think it was Liu Huaqing, the general then, who really started that process. And then the third thing, which I think is the most difficult, is that we, the Western world, has no idea what it means to run a world or part of the world on Chinese values. And the values clash is the most difficult because there are two problems. One is the kind of certainty that we think we know about our own values as Europeans or Americans. But I think in the last few years, there's been confusion. What are our values? Our political values seem divided. When we talk about key terms like democracy, we often get divided. Does, kind of the presidency of Trump, does that represent true democracy, or is it actually the opposite of that? I mean, of course, there's no kind of denial that people are very committed to their beliefs, but their beliefs are often significantly different. And I think the second problem is that there is a lack of understanding of what to make of Chinese values. And either there's a desire to say that these values are not important or to not want to know about them. I mean, I think that the West has often invested a lot into not wanting to understand China. I mean, you commit to a kind of view, almost like confirmation bias. You feel like you understand something, and no matter what evidence comes to you, you don't want to change your mind. I mean, we all do this about certain things. And I think for China, Chinese values, there's this assumption that there's this kind of set of values, that they're very problematic, that they're a conflict with the West, that they're a threat to the West. And I have argued, as have a lot of other people, including Elizabeth Perry and, very kind of distinguished scholars, have argued that Chinese values are hybrid. I mean, it's a kind of culture and a history which has had different kinds of ethical and philosophical and religious views, from Confucianism to Taoism, and then contemporary belief systems. This is a very flexible worldview, and it's something that I think it's hard to kind of immediately describe. And I think that's really one of the problems that in the current political environment in Europe and America, there's a desire to have a simple term, a simple label that you can then embrace or attack. And I think China isn't some place that you can give a simple label to. I mean, there are some aspects of China which, of course, like poverty relief, China's work in climate change, have been essential and important parts of a very good dialogue with the rest of the world. There are other issues which, of course, have been much more problematic. So it's not that there's a complete agreement or a disagreement. There's a very, very broad range of complex issues that we have to take a different position on. And I think that this is a difficult thing for many people who have never really thought about China a lot, have never really what needed to understand China. Now they have to acquire this knowledge. And I think for many of them, maybe there's not a desire to acquire the knowledge. They just want to have the opinion. Well, then, of course, their opinion is what guides them. And I suppose finally, you know, my job and the job of my colleagues is to sort of just try and kind of convey that China has this very complex worldview, these different belief systems maybe, or different attitudes, and that we have to basically understand them before we can then see what the problem is. Because some of those attitudes and beliefs, I think, are probably pretty unproblematic, and some of them may be more difficult and take a lot of dialogue. But we're not going to get very far if we don't have that dialogue. And I think that's really what is lacking at the moment, a proper dialogue on what we do agree with and what we don't agree with, and what then, most importantly, do we do about that disagreement.
Yeah, thank you, Kerry. I think that you really raised a very profound question, is that how we can read about China, how we can understand about China, particularly in the 21st century, and particularly in the post-pandemic future. That you talk about 3 points, I think is also very valid, and actually could make us all think deeply, on the equal power, whether, because of the history in the past, China in the last 200 years was very weak, and of course now it quickly surged as a global power, land and marine power also. But also, you rightly hinted on the most important thing is about the Chinese value, and then probably what some Western friends were saying. Okay, let's have a converge rather than accepting a different China. But I as you know, you are a sinologist, as Deng Xiaoping famous said, if it doesn't matter, it's a white cat, black cat, as long as it catches mice. So that we actually. China, the shoe that fits Chinese feet. I mean, now they've been wearing. I totally agree. That it's a hybrid. We have market forces, we have capitalist, some of the methodology, but also we have a socialist in general that with Chinese characteristics. For example, President Xi, recently also at elevating. Conference in Great Hall of People that way, China has lifted so much out of poverty, and China actually now has about 1.3 billion people have some kind of a medical care coverage, and also over 1 billion people have some kind of social security, which is the largest welfare system probably in the world now. So China has done right with the second largest GDP, and also people estimating that. The pandemic fighting that China maintained positive growth will accelerate China's probably economic growth in a number of years to come. So what I think now is that we have a really, as a scholar, both in China, particularly outside China as well, in many other countries, that we probably need to interpret what this phenomenon means to the future of the world, and you have done some excellent works on that. So really, I'm really appalled of what you've been doing. But also put forward deep thinking questions. That it's not black and white. I mean, in terms of a clear cut, it's really complex. But then, can we really, based on what China has been doing, based on China's contributing to the over 1/3 of the global GDP growth, based on China becoming the largest trading nation with 130 countries, based on China become a global value chain center, can we really peacefully coexist? Because otherwise we're going to face a devastating conflict, as my friend Graham Allison said many times, this Hades trap that we end up with. So I'm really really encouraged by your spirit of deep thinking and also digging into this question. So you actually, in one of your journal articles, and also in some, you actually, China in the Western foreign policy discourse is more often than not described as a problem or a challenge. And but in fact, you once said China's challenge is ontological complexity. So what do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, that's a rather grand term. I like to use these grand terms sometimes,
Sure.
but I think what is common in thinking and talking about China is this complexity, and I think that is one of the problems that when you're with an alliance, there's a sort of similarity that you can go from that, maybe a common language or a common religion, or kind of some common belief systems that then get you to kind of more complicated areas, but you have at least something to step on. And obviously, for much of their histories, Europe and China, or the previous dynasties from the Han onwards to the Tang and the Sung and the kind of Yuan and Ming and Qing, they had very limited relationships with Europe, and Europe itself was not unified, of course, and isn't unified. So you've got a kind of quite a complicated situation. And I mean, in a sense, I think for politicians, of course, the pressures on them are very great, and they've got to really come up with things which seem to be straightforward and simple. I mean, they've got to kind of, with all these different messages, they've got to convey something. I mean, Trump and his "Make America Great Again," 4 words, basically 4 words. And this sort of gets lots of people very excited, even though, of course, you can argue, and people do argue a lot about what that actually means, and whether it's possible. And it's very hard to capture the China story in just a few words. And when I'm asked, in kind of events outside of China, well, how do I explain China and its, rise in the world? It's kind of something that will take quite a lot of explanation, because it's not a capitalist country, but it uses elements of capitalism. It's a communist country, but with a very specific form of communism. The development of the Communist Party in China, really from the 1930s onwards, was very distinctive under Mao Zedong. So kind of there's all sorts of reasons why this is not an easy thing to convey in just a few words. You need an audience that have quite a lot of knowledge. And of course, many audiences don't have that knowledge because, well, they're not, they haven't had to have it until now. I mean, they may know some things about America and they may know some things about Europe, but they've never really had to think about China that much because it's always been remote from them. In the UK, I think this is particularly true. Apart from Hong Kong, the UK's historic links with China in the last century were, kind of very indirect. There's one specific thing, and then not really a great deal of interaction, and not really a great deal of knowledge. And in the kind of 1960s, when the Society of Anglo-Chinese Understanding was set up with Joseph Needham, I think it's Li Haise, the great kind of scientific kind of scholar who wrote Science and Civilization in China. I knew him very briefly at the end of the 1980s when I was a student at Key's College in Cambridge, where he was one of the fellows. These sort of figures were exceptional. They weren't a part of the mainstream at all. And, in many ways, people could do most of the things they wanted without any real knowledge of China at all. When I was growing up, China was not part of my world. I remember in September 1976, the day when I saw the sort of this elderly Chinese man's face on TV, and the announcement was that that the leader of China, Mao Zedong, had died. That was the first time I'd seen news about China on TV. And so I think it's been a big and dramatic change that now we have something like 150,000 Chinese students in universities in Britain. And, China is much more present, and it's the world, it's the largest trading partner in Australia. It's obviously, huge economic player. These are all very new things, and they're kind of happening very, very quickly. And I think it was always going to be difficult to have a new player come along who appeared so quickly. That was always going to be difficult. On top of which, politically and culturally, this new player is very different to ones that have been dominant in the last 150 years. I mean, this is the sort of most problematic thing, that there are three big differences. The new emergence of China as an important player, that's a big difference. Wasn't like that before. The second is China's political difference to the Americans and Europeans. And the third is cultural difference. So we need to have three kinds of knowledge. Well, this is very, very difficult. I think if you look at the situation in Australia, so many people say that Australia has it's worked out a strategy towards China. But I think it's not true. I mean, Australia has had extremely important economic links with China. There are 1.5 million Australians of Chinese heritage, and until recently, Australian universities had many, many Chinese students. And over the last 18 months, the relationship between Australia and China has obviously really deteriorated. And I mean, I'm not going to kind of talk about whose fault that is, but I do think that in Australia, there is obviously some issues about the way in which Australia has sort of a kind of very sensitive worry about its own identity. I mean, is it an Asian country? I mean, or is it just a European colony in Asia? I mean, that was historically the sort of idea and the identity. And I think, those are really domestic issues. They're not about China so much. They're about, the identity of Australians and who they think they are and where they think they belong. And they're always there. I mean, they were always there when Japan was a dominant economy in the 1980s. When I lived in Australia in the early 1990s, it was Japan that was regarded as, the problem. Then Indonesia, because of being so close to Australia. And so it seems to me that China has become the third of these sort of worrying neighbors that Australia, kind of thinks is a threat, not just because of its economic and political issues, but because of identity issues. And I think that's where the dialogue about China becomes most difficult, because, of course, in terms of economic structure, in terms of politics, I think, yes, we can certainly identify areas where we should be concerned. We should have, kind of very tough dialogue with partners in China. Yeah, for sure. Trade negotiations were never easy, but we need to have them. And I think we know where we're trying to kind of get to. But I think what's worried me in the last year, and I think it's the thing that most disturbs me, is that underneath a lot of these valid concerns, which we should talk about and will talk about, there is something which is much more about identity and this idea of China being a threat because it's not like us. And when you ask, what does it mean to be not like us? It kind of creeps into areas about, well, China is, ethnically different and culturally different. And, it's just not kind of possible for the world to have a non-European or a non-American country that is going to be very dominant and very prominent. And the reason for that is not clearly economic and not clearly political. It's about something else. Now, I think the vast majority of people are not thinking this way, but I do think that it kind of is an area that we have to be very concerned about. It's always been a problem in thinking about China and Asia generally in Australia and Britain and America, that there's the valid concerns, but they get mixed up with these more racial issues. And I think these more racial issues have become more vociferous, particularly in the Trump presidency. and there are expressions of opinions which I find sometimes to be purely based on this idea of race, which I find, repugnant. I think it's something that we have to condemn, but it's something that still, is having space, and that's a very, very huge worry.
Yeah, thank you, Kerry. I think you really outlined, I think, very profound challenge actually that China is facing. Peaceful rise, but then the world really, particularly the Western world, has an understanding on China. As you said, it's a different culture, different history, and probably a different system. So how that can reconcile with the rest of the values or traditionally views on China? That really things are changing too fast, and China probably is doing too well in terms of Economically, China is the largest trading partner for 130 countries, and so many countries really depend on China. Like neighboring countries like ASEAN become the largest trading partner, and China also become the largest trading nation to EU as well. And but I think that's something you raised very well. I think that it's really for the scholars and think tank community, policymakers, to really think deeply. How can we have a new narrative, really, to interpret China or explain China? I think there's first for China, we have a lot of work to do to have a new narrative, upgrade our new narrative, or maybe, but also for the Western world, we need more exchanges, as you said, particularly dialogue. I mean, we just had the Australia embassy council of ministers visit us just 2 days ago. We have a lot of dialogue. I think that really helped. And also that now China, is developing so fast, but maybe we should not use the traditional lens to look at China. For example, China right now has 1 billion smartphone users. You can probably think China has a digital, some kind of democracy online, where to go, what to buy, people making, self-making decisions every day, and then collectively they form the market democracy. And on top of that, China now with all the modern communication technology, and it's not like old days that emperor is far away, the mountain is high, and everybody's autocratic, and then make all those autocratic decisions. Now, everybody and also the leadership is well informed, and actually also China has its own consultative democracy. Like Foreign Minister Wang, you mentioned that China have this consolidated democracy, like on the 14th five-year plan. China has many layers of discussions and roundtables, and then actually seek 1 million suggestions and comments and revisions. So you can see it does have, which is the upcoming 2 section. Also, it's an annual debate on Chinese policy. So there's quite a lot of consolidated democracy as well. And whereas I think digital democracy, technology, and with the movement of the people, China has 700,000 students study abroad every year, which we track that annually on our Blue Book on Chinese students study abroad with CAS publishing. But also China has over 100 million people before the pandemic traveling around the world. So I think the world probably, as you mentioned, that is really such a tough challenge to really match the some kind of value, because if we can contribute to the human being growth, if we can contribute to the prosperity and development of the mankind, why not we a bit more tolerant to different system, or like Fukuyama-san said, it's not end of the history now. So what we really scholars in China around the world, how we can have a more discussion, dialogue on that, I think is absolutely crucial, as you just said. I noticed that from 1998 to 2005, you worked at actually British Foreign and Commonwealth Office, which is you were a diplomat. You were as a first secretary at the British Embassy in Beijing, which is you have a lot of experience on the foreign affairs, but also then head of Indonesia, Philippines, and East Timor section. Also from 1994 to 1996, you lived in the Inner Mongolia region in China. So you are truly a China hand. So how, being a diplomat, a scholar, a think tanker, how did you, and also historical view, I mean, you're now doing your new book now. How did you reconcile that with, the challenge we have now? I mean, you've been someone really know China. So what do you see the gap between this Western understood by, particularly in the foreign policy area, that China and academics in the West, there's always there's a lot of understanding, and how we can altogether maybe overcome that differences.
Yeah, I guess that there are sort of two ways of acquiring knowledge. One is deliberately, and the other is by accident. And I mean, a lot of my knowledge about China, if I've got knowledge about China, it's been acquired probably more by accident than design. I mean, I didn't do Chinese as a student at Cambridge. I did English literature. And so afterwards, then I developed an interest in China. Actually, while living in Japan in 1991, I visited China. I went to Beijing for a week, and then I really felt, wow, I want to know more about this place. And after that, really concentrated on understanding Chinese language and history, more modern history than imperial history. But since then, I have, of course, read as much as I could about the kind of long kind of narrative of Chinese histories. I guess I mean, it's a very difficult thing, because the easy thing to say about improving the situation that we are in now is to say education. I mean, we need to have more education certainly in British schools about Chinese civilization and Chinese history. We need to have more people studying Chinese. We need to make China familiar. But that probably will have very very difficult to assess outcomes. Just because you know more about something or somewhere doesn't mean you're going to have an easier attitude towards it. I mean, after all, the British views towards Europe are, kind of very complicated, and we know more about Europe than we do about China, for sure. People study French and German and Italian at schools, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to have a very friendly view. They may, in fact, end up having a less friendly view. So I don't think that we can just assume that education is going to be the golden kind of medicine. I think, it's going to mean a long period of adjustment. I don't believe, like the Thucydides trap. I don't really think that that's the issue, because I think this is a unique problem now. It's never happened before, that in effect you've got two nuclear powers. I mean, America and China are two nuclear powers who will not use the ultimate the ultimate weapon against each other, because it will mean, mutual destruction. So this really restrains what they can do with each other. The second problem is that, unlike the Soviet Union, obviously China is in some ways a capitalist actor. I mean, its sort of economy has strong elements that seem very similar to capitalism, and it's integrated into the global finance and supply chain system. And for all the talk about decoupling, this is not very likely to happen, because I mean, the attractiveness of the Chinese domestic market is also going to be a very, very big incentive for companies, wherever they're from, to engage with China. And we saw this with the drafting of an investment agreement between Europe and China at the end of last year. At the same time, obviously, as Europe is increasingly arguing with China about, human rights and other issues, it's also agreeing, the framework for an investment agreement. So you've got immediate kind of conflict between what what the Europeans want. They want one thing but not the other, but they can't pick them apart, even though they try to sort of say that doing one means you do the other. In fact, it's increasingly difficult. So I think when you look at the complexity of the problems, the most you can say is that I don't think the worst outcome is going to happen, thankfully. I think that it's likely that issues like climate change are going to get more serious and mean that the pressure for China and Europeans and Americans to work together gets greater for self-interest. And that gives a pathway to finding out ways in which we can work together for a common good. But I also think that we are going to have to construct this language of disagreement. We just have to say, okay, in any argument, no one walks away completely winning. No one walks away completely, well, not often completely losing. An argument where someone is just completely defeated is probably not good, because they'll be very resentful. What you want is an exchange. And, there are ways in which partners can talk to each other all the time. We do this all the time. As people, as communities, as institutions, we have dialogue, we agree, we disagree, and we reach some kind of midpoint. Now, with China, that's going to be a multi-layered discussion. We are obviously a long way into it, but we've got a long, long way to go. And what we're looking for, I think, is a framework where we can agree to disagree. I think that's the really important thing, because I don't think, the strange thing is that I think we are clear about where we're going to agree. We're going to agree on climate change. We're going to agree on how to deal with global health issues. We're going to agree on sustainability. I think there's a consensus. So with China, we're dealing with a partner on those issues. And those are the big issues about human survival. But we are going to need to have a way of dealing with our disagreements, because while those are significant, they are not important enough to jeopardize human, the future of humanity. What could be important? What could be more important than that? So I think this is the stage we're in. I think it's going to be a very long stage. I don't think this is going to be sorted out very easily. What it means, Henry, is that you and I are in a growing area. We're in a growing sector, because there's going to be no sort of bankruptcies where we're working, because I think this is going to be, it's a golden age of diplomacy, a golden age of dialogue, and that's good. But it doesn't mean that the dialogue will be easy. I think we have to just accept that. So this is a long phase we're in, and we shouldn't try and accelerate things too much. We shouldn't try and fool ourselves that it's going to be easy. We just have to deal with our disagreements step by step.
Yeah, thank you, Kerry. I think you're absolutely hit on some of the right challenges that we are facing. I agree that we really have to have more dialogue, but also how we can really deepen this understanding of each other is a daunting task for scholars like us, and of course, all the China watchers. But also more than that, the international community with such a rapidly developing China, rising China, how we can really shape this new understanding narrative, and that we really, as you said, agree to disagree. At least, let's not fight, but let's talk, let's discuss, and let's really seek the, a common ground, but also keep the differences. That's really, as Chinese say, 求同存异. That's absolutely necessary. So talk about the more geopolitical, but maybe international relation. You mentioned about the U.S. Now that we have a new U.S. President Biden now is in in power now for over a month now. But I noticed that in his first speech, internationally lively broadcasted at Munich Security Conference, where leaders of Atlantic nations that joined at about 3 hours conference. CCG Secretary General was actually invited to raise a question there. But basically, what I see from President Biden said that China will be a strategic competitor. He didn't use the word rivalry. I mean, like the President Biden used in the past. He talked about, there's a lot of challenge that U.S. is going to face with China, but also there's an area like climate change, like things like pandemic fighting that we can really work together. I'm very glad to see that President Biden actually pledged on the same day at the G7 summit, $2 billion to support the developing countries in fighting pandemic. Actually, President Xi actually pledged $2 billion 6 months or 8 months earlier. So I see that the two leaders now are really, they had a long dialogue on the eve of the Chinese New Year for 2 hours on the telephone call, which is, President Biden, wish all the Lunar New Year's to the Chinese Americans, but also when he had the phone with the President Xi to the Chinese people. So I think there's some positive elements I can see. So what do you see from now on the Sino-U.S. relations? I mean, whether the trade will still be a hot issue, or maybe the U.S. is now seeking more Western alliance. Where I see on the Munich Security Conference broadcasting live, where Angela Merkel and President Macron didn't echo President Biden completely. Merkel said China, we have to, deal with China, but China is also a country to collaborate. Whereas President Macron says, of course, EU now strategically probably will be more independent because U.S. now have an Indo-Pacific now. So what do you think about, for the Biden administration, the next 4 years that he's in office? And also, I also noticed that recently U.S. General Chamber of Commerce has issued a report that the trade war actually could cost U.S. 1% GDP and several 100,000 jobs. So what do you think the U.S. new government would do, economically, continue Trump's policy, or maybe politically, or geopolitically, or alliance building? Even alliance building, like ASEAN leaders would not take a side, as the Prime Minister of Singapore, Lee Hsien Loong, just said, we don't want to side with any side on containing China or for that matter. So how can that relation be continued in a more constructively, or maybe we can repair somehow the Sino-U.S. relations?
Yeah, I mean, I think the tone of the new American president compared to the previous one obviously is different, and that will help, because often the very provocative, aggressive language of Trump created its own problems. I guess it's often not really kind of thought about, but the second thing is that Trump didn't really delegate properly. I mean, he didn't build a team around him. It was very unstable. It was really all about him and him deciding everything. And so, the fact is that Biden has a very competent team around him. Obviously, you've got Blinken as his Secretary of State, but you've got, kind of other people who are, very experienced and capable. And it seems that there's much more of a team ethos. So I think that's probably going to be helpful. I guess the third thing is that although Europe and America are not going to be completely aligned, I think that they're speaking more with each other now about China, and actually just sort of trying to work out their common points. And that will probably be helpful, because I think it's good for America to realize that it cannot really promote a China policy on its own. It's got to have allies. And I think that means that there'll be more multilateralism, and probably some of its more extreme ideas in the Trump era will disappear. There'll be more moderation and a bit more kind of nuance. Fundamentally, though, the issue for America is the most serious because, it's currently the world's biggest economy, and China is competing with that. And I think this is psychologically a huge moment. There'll be a day sometime in the next 5 to 10 years, probably sooner rather than later, where we'll wake up one morning and China will be the world's biggest economy. And this will be an historic moment, the first time in modern history that an Asian country has been number one. The first time in modern history when China has been economically number one. The first time in history when a communist country has been number one. I mean, this is a huge moment. And symbolically, it's going to be incredibly difficult for America to know that they are going to be number two economically. Now, of course, in many other areas, they won't be number two militarily, and in terms of their alliances, they'll be number one. But I think it's going to really have an impact on their view of themselves and how they, kind of their status in the world. And this is going to be a problem. I think America has a sense of self-esteem and, pride. And just because they will no longer economically be in the number one position, I think this is going to then feed a lot of other doubts. For many years, we've had to kind of wonder whether America is a declining power, and have often said many, many times, no, it's still dominant in many areas, across economics, into technology, into, the world's biggest companies are mostly American. The world's, kind of military, if you added up, I think the, top five, they would still not equal America's expenditure. It's still the most powerful country, and it's likely to be so for a long time. But this one kind of indicator, America's economic status, is going to be symptomatic for many of, a shift. It's going to be very tangible, a very powerful moment. And I think this is the kind of thing that is really feeding a lot of the anxiety in America, that actually it's not just about economic change. It will then mean a whole bunch of other changes because, in effect, America will no longer be the richest country in the world. For sure, per capita, of course, it's totally different. China is still middle-income country, basically, a moderately prosperous country per capita. But in total, China will be the richest country in the world. So this will mean many, many things. It's an enormously important geopolitical moment. One of the key moments of, modern history, and probably more significant than the collapse of the, Soviet Union, probably more significant than any event since the Second World War. This is going to be an enormous and important event. And it's already starting to have an impact. Already you can see with China's economic growth being greater than that of America coming out of the pandemic. Every day it's getting closer to that target. And I think when that target is even closer, there will be more political turbulence, because I think America is very uneasy about this moment. And when it was looking at Japan being, I think it was about, I think Japan was about sort of 2/3 the size of the American economy in the late 1980s. There was already this anxiety, about how do we deal with Japan, and that kind of problem went. And I think there's a hope in China, a hope in America that the same will happen with China, that there'll be some issue and that China's growth will fall. But at the moment, we don't see that. The pandemic has had some impact, but the IMF shows that at least this year, China is likely to grow well and is likely to continue to grow well. So unless there is a total disaster, then I think that China's on this path to being the dominant economy. and the political implications of that are very, very profound.
Yeah, I think you have really made a very right, accurate analysis of the situation that we're going to see in the next 5 to 10 years. China is rising rapidly and economically, politically, so that how can really the world, particularly the US, accept that? You know, as you said, you know, they've been in the #1 position for hundreds of years, 100 years now, but now we have this new China probably overtaking US as the largest economy in the world. Psychologically, it takes a while probably to adjust. But also I think that now we are in a very challenging world now. You know, with, for example, we are facing this pandemic. It really needs China, US, EU, and all the other countries together to fight the common enemy to the humankind. We have this climate change where President Biden holds very dearly to his position, you know, to fight that. And they need China to collaborate. So hopefully, you know, we could have this, we could have a more common interest while the world evolves, develops, the new challenges, the new risk, and the new catastrophe that will really, the human race will united, and let's set aside, you know, ideological differences and also some of the, you know, bias on each other, but let's work on how we can face a common enemy and a common threat. So I'm thinking that, for example, the Second World War, where US led a new international order, you know, we had a Bretton Woods moment, and that we had a new Bretton Woods system. Now we couldn't say we had a Third World War, but we really had a pandemic World War. But maybe after that, should we have a new Bretton Woods moment where we can enhance and increase some global public goods and global governance system, like, for example, how we can fight future pandemic crisis. And also, of course, can we have a world climate organization of some kind? Or can we really upgrade? Because the infrastructure is lacking in many other countries now, even in the US, is also crumbling to some extent sometimes. But, you know, can we really, for example, upgrade the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank to a world infrastructure investment bank, where China and US can work together, coupled with the World Bank and all the development banks, and let's probably make a Belt and Road that China and US work together to infrastructure revolution to modernize the whole world, that we have some common things to work along rather than we fight each other. So that's really, I think you pose a lot of deep thinking questions for us to digest, which is I think very, very necessary. But also, again, on Europe, I mean, you mentioned about Europe now, and Europe is really in a unique position. I mean, how do you see EU now, which have now signed this comprehensive agreement on investment with China, which is on the last day of last year, of Germany's chairship of the EU, and we're still going to be ratified by many EU countries. But this kind of the business, the ties, now China becoming EU's largest trading partner. Can EU also, as you said, is very important, probably allies of US. Can EU play some kind of mediation role, or maybe let's have a trilateral summit between EU, US, and China, and let's really work together, and EU can be really not directly confronting with China, but also have a lot of common interest, but it's shared a long history, but also it has a good relation with the US, has a good business ties with China. So how do you see this CAI, you know, new investment treaty, and then the future role of EU with China and with US?
Well, I mean, one of the strange things is that in recent years, really Europe, China, and America haven't kind of had a formal trilateral dialogue at all. I mean, they never really sit down with each other and talk about common issues. I mean, may do it as part of the G20 or other fora, but they don't, as three separate entities, sit down and talk together. And I mean, part of that is because I think that the Chinese and the Americans are very jealous of their relationship. They don't want others to come in. You know, they're the two great powers, and so they are quite protective. I think the second reason is really because, of course, the European Union is now 27 member states, and it's different to America and China. I mean, it's not a single sovereign entity. It's you know, kind of a consortium. And of course, with the British leaving the European Union, which was a very unfortunate thing, but with that happening, we now see kind of Europe consolidating again. And for a while it looked like Europe was really threatened as a project. It goes through ups and downs. I mean, Europe is perpetually in crisis in a way, but in a sense you're kind of always having to acknowledge that this consortium is more helpful than it's not. It does deal with some issues well, and investment protocols probably are one of those issues. It's a good way of negotiating with people because of the size of the European investment and trade market. So, I mean, the kind of ways in which Europe, China, and Europe, China, and America can talk to each other. This would be a very important global gathering. At the moment, it's true that Europe and China have their high-level dialogue, and I think that happens annually. I mean, it happened, I think, kind of at the end of last year. There was, the kind of annual meeting online, and the High Representative for Foreign Affairs, Ursula von Leyen, and then the President of the EU, the President of the EU, Ursula von Leyen, and then the High Representative for Foreign Affairs met Xi Jinping, and they had their discussion. And I mean, obviously, China and the US have their, it used to be called, I think, the high-level economic and strategic dialogue. I think it's now called the high-level high-level communication dialogue or something. It's changed its name slightly. So that has been meeting. And also the Europeans and the Americans have a dialogue on China. So the one thing that's missing is that they all get together. Now, is that possible? I mean, I think on climate change and on pandemics, of course, it makes a lot of sense. Whether they'll be able to find common cause is another matter. I mean, I think for America, it feels still that it should be in charge of the relationship with China, so it doesn't mind Europe agreeing with it, but it doesn't like it so much when Europe disagrees with it. For China, I think it is aware that, in a sense, it's going to go into a meeting where there's always going to be two against it. I mean, China and will be facing America and Europe, where they're probably likely on very tough things to sort of, outvote it and kind of, disagree with it. So I don't think that we're quite at the moment where, these three will be actually separate, like as three sitting down. I think on climate change, though, almost certainly, they are commonly aligned. I mean, Biden has brought, America back into the Paris Convention. Europe is committing lots to decarbonizing its economies and environment. And of course, China has committed to complete decarbonization or not producing any carbon by 2060. And I think its targets will become more ambitious. So this is an area of big mutual collaboration. And I think, if these three, basically, if you say that America, Europe, and China agree on something in this area, then it will have a huge impact, especially if you can bring India into it. Then you've already covered a vast, vast part of the world in terms of its population and its geography, and of course, its economy. And once you have those, kind of in place, then others will maybe follow. The leadership role for the three here is absolutely huge. So I'm hopeful that that's going to be really where you see how proper kind of dialogue and collaboration with China can happen, and where it can lead to very beneficial outcomes for everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Kerry. I think that the idea actually comes out of for the last 2 or 3 years, Center for China and Globalization. We every year we went to goes to a Munich Security Conference. I mean, we actually proposed at Munich Security Conference that why can't we have a trilateral dialogue of some kind? Because particularly during the last 2 years, when the China and US have a fierce trade war. And also on the aircraft on the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea, everywhere is very tense with sanctions on a daily basis. When former President Biden and Secretary Pompeo was every day basically. That, you have that kind of tense moment. If we have if two big guys quarrel, then you need a third party to really intervene or mediate, at least to let them calm down. I think that where is how is arise that we thought of that on that. But I see actually after we mentioned that at Munich Security Conference, the EU and the US now set up a dialogue on China without China participating when Pompeo was still there. So what I'm seeing is that maybe we hope. You're absolutely right. All these global issues, we really need the US, China, EU to work together. Climate change. Pandemic fighting is another good example on WHO cooperation. So another suggestion we made is that maybe on top of G7, we could add China, India, and Russia for a climate summit. Whereas, over half of the world population and over 60–70% of the 6 biggest, emitters of the carbon among those 10. So somehow we have to really re-engineer or reinvigorate the post-pandemic New Bretton Woods moment that we need to find a new mechanism. Of course, G20 is great too, United Nations, everything is great, but I think we need a little bit more focused on the specialty like that. So that's where I think that we said about these new proposals from think tank point of view. But since you are now in UK, you live in London, I want to bring you to another question about this Brexit. Of course, you've been experiencing that, and then we see globalization, deglobalization going on, and then finally now you separate from EU. But now I notice also that UK is applying for joining CPTPP. So UK still has a lot of influence. I mean, a lot of soft power too. I think that either UK joins the CPTPP or maybe working closely with China, like Theresa May said, the global Britain. I mean, if you look beyond EU, at the Far East is China. So that is so important. So what do you think about China UK relation, particularly now we have a lot of seems to have a lot of dispute on many issues like Hong Kong and things like that. How can we really reconcile that, and then can we really get back to the golden age if possible? And then, because as you said, UK is still the second largest destination for Chinese students. Over 150 to 200,000 students were there. Tourism and many other collaboration. 48 groups, have traditionally worked with China for many years. So what can be done? And what do you think about UK's new role now with collaboration with China and also in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been a difficult year because of COVID-19 and because of, I think, a kind of increasingly sort of political fight. Part of the reason for that is I think historically the Conservative Party, when they've been in power, have been maybe more confrontational with China. I mean, that seems to be my memory, that when the Conservatives are in, there's usually more fights with China. And they are now the kind of dominant party And there is a significant group within the Conservative Party that have created this organization called the China Research Group. And, you know, they clearly see China as a very particular kind of problem, and are keen to kind of, you know, sort of make that the way that we understand China in the UK. And I mean, on the whole, as I've said, historically, the Chinese sort of image in the UK has not been a high profile one. It's been more marginal. Britain has not kind of paid a huge amount of attention to China. Its main interests have been Europe and America. And so there's a sort of lack of understanding probably of what China is and what China should mean. And now we have a lot of people who do talk about China, but they're talking about it almost all in the kind of framework of COVID-19 and, you know, all of the political issues about where did that come from, how did it happen, and, you know, who's to blame. So this has kind of really made the discussion on China in the UK a little bit distorted. You know, the longer term issues have been lost sight of. And a lot of people are talking about China now who never had much of an opinion about it before because it suits their particular political interests. The populist politician Nigel Farage has suddenly started taking note of China, and, you know, he's obviously a nationalistic kind of figure. He was the kind of maybe one of the main influences behind Britain leaving the European Union. And I think that's really unfortunate. You know, once someone with his kind of track record of just creating problems and creating divisions and creating resentments, manipulating, when they kind of become interested in an issue, it usually makes the public debate more difficult. Despite that, I think that British people are pragmatic. I think that there are going to be lots of opportunities to find spaces to work. I think that we are more moderate in our approach. We have many people, I think, trying to influence us now. We have, you know, kind of these sort of strange, kind of slightly kind of, you know, kind of worrying figures like, you know, Clive Hamilton, this Australian academic who's been kind of making some big claims about how China influences politics in the world. But, you know, these are things that only he seems to be able to see because he can see this hidden hand, but no one else can really kind of see it as clearly as him. Well, you know, I think this kind of language in the UK does have a bit of influence, but I'm also sure that there are much more moderate voices here who are more thoughtful. And when I talk to politicians, I'm struck by the fact that maybe in public they say one thing, but in private, they are aware of the complexity of what they're looking at, and they're trying to find a kind of road in which we can look after our interests, but also acknowledge some of the disagreements. And I think, you know, that's what we're all about. You know, we're all trying to find that kind of middle road. We're all trying to look after our interests, but also trying to acknowledge that, you know, we need to cooperate in certain key areas. And there are other areas where we're not going to be able to see eye to eye. And I think politicians have not gone to the extremes, maybe as some in Australia or some in America. You know, there's no very prominent public figure who has so far signed up to this idea of a, you know, kind of huge China threat. You know, I think we are not at that level. But, you know, it's still being kind of developed, this issue. And I think it's something that we shouldn't be lazy about. So for my work, you know, I'm not kind of here to convert anyone. I just want to have the best possible debate about issues around China, the best understanding of what we think about China and what China, you know, kind of means to the UK. I'm optimistic because in most surveys, it seems that moderates and those who are more pragmatic outnumber the more extremists. I'm not saying that there aren't things that we shouldn't be concerned about and we shouldn't really focus on. But I do think that we need to be pragmatic. And that's something we can learn from the Chinese, because I think, you know, in the last few decades, the Chinese have also been pragmatic, and it seems to have worked in some areas for China. So I hope that pragmatism can work for us.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Kerry, on that. So my final question would be from me would be, now we have a lot of as we, for the last an hour and a half discussion we have is that we have a lot of a discussion centered on the gap between China and the outside world, how we can minimize that gap. One of the things I realized, for example, what has happened in the U.S. where populism is strong, where President Trump got elected, but also we noticed that the most richest people in the Wall Street, like 1% of that, is equal almost to half of the general mass population of the U.S. So the gap is widening the rich and the poor. I mean, China had that issues too, but Chinese government is really mobilized all it can to eliminate the extreme poverty, where they just announced that last week that they have achieved that elevating 100 million people in the last 8 years of this new objective, 100 billion out of that. So totally 800 million. So what do you think? Because domestically they all have that kind of issue. I noticed that President Biden wants to raise the minimum wage from $7.8 to $15. Probably wants to address that extreme poverty issue in the U.S. But very often this kind of issue domestically, China become a scapegoat because, for example, all the manufacture was made in China, but doesn't mean China take all the profit. Whereas Chinese export, multinational accounts 40, even 50% of that. Apple phone, that sells $1,000 in the U.S. Maybe China made $50 of that. So, but on the count, on the CIF or FOB, that export value, China maybe got half of that, which is not necessarily true. So what do you think? How we can really address this? Global governance is falling behind global practice, whereas multinational probably made a huge gains in the last number of years, last 2 or 3 decades, whereas they are probably not benefiting the host country enough and not home country enough. So that we need the international coordination to have a new, probably kind of governance system to really benefit in all the countries, so that we can really not having so strong populism uprisings throughout the world.
Yeah, I think the achievements that China has in poverty reduction and alleviation and elimination should be better appreciated in the outside world. And even I looked on the BBC website when the announcement was made that poverty elimination had happened, and I think there was a recognition that yes, in the last 40 years, however you define it, a huge number of people have been lifted out of poverty in China. Whatever the reasons for that, it's an achievement. I think we need to recognize that. This is why China is not a straightforward story, for all the things that people are very critical about, and maybe should be critical about. There are some things which are huge achievements and they should also be celebrated. And yet it's not easy to kind of say that sometimes, because it's like the narrative is always going to be very negative and you don't really get much coverage of those things which are very, much more positive. I think that what strikes me is that the achievement that China has made is something that we can all learn from. And I suppose, a simple answer to what you just said is we need to have a forum for learning, not maybe for dialogue. I think we need a forum for learning. And that is a two-way process. And I think one of the final mindsets is, it's always been as though, America and Europe was going to China to teach, to show how you do things. And I think now we need to kind of have some recognition that there are many, many things where China can come to the rest of the world and teach and show how you can do. Building high-speed railways has been one very, very huge achievement. Poverty alleviation is another. There's green technology things that China's doing. There's innovations in other areas of technology. Yes, there are some areas where this is not going to be possible, but there are other areas where I think we've got to learn from each other. And so I think the era of the great learning should start. And it shouldn't be really just about learning being all one way. it should definitely be learning from people who have something to teach, and that at the moment includes China, which has a lot to teach about, you know, kind of the things that I've just outlined, and will continue to have a lot to teach.
Well, thank you, Kerry, for your really you know, kind word on that. I think China China has benefited also greatly. I think China alleviating poverty also attribute to, you know, China joining the globalization. For example, you know, since China joined the WTO, China's GDP has gone up 11, 12 times. You know, and the multinational working in China has also employed the hundreds of thousands of migrants and the coastal cities, and so actually multinational accounts almost 40% of Chinese exports. So I think it's a global effort, but with Chinese really dedicated, constantly with a strong leadership and determination to do that, and also with one 5-year plan after another 5 years plan. So there, you're right. There's some merits there, but how we can, you know, better tell our story and better accepted outside China is still a challenge for our think tank scholars. Today, actually, Kerry, you've been really kind to spend so much time. Actually, we actually had some questions. We have, this is live online. We have over, through different portals, we have over 700,000 viewers, listeners on our different portals in China and outside China. And we have actually collected some questions from our media. I mean, I just want to maybe give a summary of that, and maybe you can give some final answer on that. For example, we have a question from China, China.org, China Internet Information Center, China Daily, and also we have China Radio International, and China Red Star News and things like that. So, but I see they have a number of questions, but basically concentrated on these two sections coming up. So do you think this annual ritual of 10, 15 days of a National People's Congress and then Chinese Political Consultative Conference is really a national exercise for half a month, basically, before and after debate and discussion, and then particularly this year, China going to summarize what has been achieved in the 13th five-year plan. People are expecting Premier Lee's working report, and also, of course, China going to propose a new 14th five-year plan. So what do you think about this 14th five-year plan, and also these two sections in the Chinese political life, and would that be really, you know, have a different system that really also being quite effective in terms of coming up one 5-year plan of another 5-year plan, but also annually, this kind of exercise shows some kind of collective you know, effectiveness. So basically, their question is centered around 14th five-year plan. What do you think about the two sections? And also, actually, one of the report was mentioned. You have also published a book about China in 2020, and talking about 70 years anniversary of People's Republic establishment. So you know, I'm because of time, we're already a bit over. I'm collecting all the questions to you, so maybe you can give your.
Sure. Yeah. Look, I mean, I think last year the delayed National People's Congress and the two meetings, I think it was in May. The main emphasis was on, you know, what is China going to do about the kind of alleviating the impact of COVID-19, and I think this is going to be the same interest this year. I think the world will be very interested to know what China's plans are for, you know, really developing its economy after the enormous hit of COVID-19. I mean, I think that there's always interest in what are China's plans about, you know, environmental protection. I mean, unemployment. I think last year there was an announcement about improving, you know, urban unemployment, and so I think there's going to be kind of a lot of focus this year on, is there going to be any moves to sort of continue to address issues of underemployment or unemployment, and maybe any innovations that the Chinese government is going to make in dealing with the impact of COVID-19. You know, is there going to be increased health spending? Is there going to be, you know, not only attempt to have a green budget, but also a healthy budget? A lot of money in Western countries is going into mental health. Is China going to make similar commitments, you know, about mental health? these are things where I think we see an alignment, that the common problem of the impact of the pandemic means that the policy issues that China is facing are similar to those of, kind of the rest of the world. And maybe there'll be some, kind of clues to how maybe the rest of the world might deal with their problems from looking at what China does. China looks like it's going to deliver positive growth, and that is going to be, a great achievement, particularly in the current circumstances. So I think the concentration will be on what measures China is going to make to try to restore and then make its economy, as dynamic as it was before the pandemic. That is, I think, what are going to really interest people. Thanks.
Great. Okay, great. So thank you, Kerry, for really taking part in the CCG China and World Dialogue series. I think it's really, we had a very stimulating, very fruitful discussion. I think this kind of exactly symbolize what you said, that we need more dialogue and among the scholars. So I think we have left ourselves and our viewers enough food for thought. It's almost supper time in Beijing, and we really hope that we got enough information to continue our thinking and discussion. So really appreciate your time and participating in our series. We also we could have another one coming up in the next 2 months. But I think this kind of exercise really enjoyable, and also I appreciate that your insights and your sharing of your views, and also we really look forward to your new coming up new book, and we hope that we will have more discussion and trying to really shake some new thinking and new narrative in the future. That really, I want to thank you very much for taking the time, and also want to thank our viewers, 700, 800,000 of them on this afternoon, and also our media friends who has posed those questions. So we will stop here, and I want to say goodbye to you, Kerry, and also to our viewers. And I want to thank all of you very much.
Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you. See you again soon.